Today I want to talk about feeding horses. Now you will notice here we have quite a few ingredients, and I don't know. I'm not even sure where to start on this one, but well, let's just say this is not a simple thing. I'm going to start by saying I am not a nutritional expert. It has taken me many years to acquire the little bit of information that I do have. And it's not easy. There's not a lot of sources. Up until recent years, there's actually been very little study done on the nutritional requirements for a horse. Very difficult, very tricky subject. And just to give you an idea how complicated it can be, let's talk about humans for a minute. Just to give you an idea, it's not all that simple. Because even with humans, we all have different requirements. Aside from each individual has got an individual metabolism that may have slightly different nutritional needs. If you ever walk into a store looking for some multivitamins, you'll find that they've got them broken down into quite a few categories already. And this is just for humans. You got your kids, you got your adults, you got your older adults, and you got your seniors. You also have your men's and women's. It's broken down into gender as well. So there, in total, there's probably 8 different kinds of multivitamins that you can get just for humans. Now, with the horse, it gets a little more complicated than that because you can't just go into a store and buy a multivitamin that's going to cover all your needs. How do you know what your horse needs? Well, unfortunately, a lot of people, and this is one of the reasons I decided to do this, is because it's a very serious problem that is very, very common. And a lot of very well-meaning people will start giving extra feeds and supplements to their horses without actually knowing what the horse needs. And there's several ways of determining that. Now, one of the ones you're going to hear a lot about is hay analysis. That's okay if you have one horse and you're the supplier of the hay, or you get it from the same person all the time, that sort of thing. That's easy to do. But that's still not quite enough. And well, in a case like this, the facility here, we've got probably close to 50 horses right now. We go through a lot of hay, and even though we have one hay man that brings it, it may come from different areas, and sometimes even just a few miles down the road can make a huge difference. One field to another can change the content of that hay because the hay isn't going to have anything in it that isn't already in the ground. Different types of hay also have different ingredients at different levels. Always things that have to be considered before you start giving your horse anything extra. In most cases, the horse is actually, if it's a good hay, your horse is going to get everything it needs just from the hay. You don't have to give it any kinds of feeds or grains or supplements of any kind. But don't just assume that, because sometimes, depending on where the hay comes from, it may have some big holes in its lineup of ingredients. How to find out? Well, going back to the hay analysis, that's one. But see, personally, I have 4 horses, and they're different ages, different genders, different breeds. Well, they have different metabolisms. So I actually took the expense of having blood tests done on all 4. Now, that can get a little costly if you got quite a few horses, but in the long run, probably worth it. And especially if you've only got one, my goodness, you're going to probably pay more. Well, actually, that little tub right there cost me more than the blood test for one horse. So if you have only one horse, believe me, getting blood tests done is not a big expense. Oh, and by the way, that funny colored stuff right there, you might think that's an odd color, but that's actually just salt. But it has cobalt in it, which is why it gives it that odd color. That's oats. We're just using that as a base to put all this other stuff into. And the syringe there, no, we're not going to give the horse an injection. We just use that for water. We put a little water in it to put onto our oats to make the other stuff all stick to it so it doesn't just sink to the bottom. That way you get a nice uniform mix. Get back to what we're talking about, though. In order to determine the individual horse's needs, I had blood tests done. So I know what levels are deficient. And I've been fortunate. I've managed to come up with pretty close to what they need with the ingredients I've been able to come up with. In fact, I live I live in, the horses are just outside of the largest city in the province, and yet there's only a couple of stores here that sell this stuff, and the selection is very limited. And in your area where you live, it's going to be different than what I can get here too, because manufacturers are going to be one country to another, or even one area to another, are going to vary, and what options that they have available to you are also going to vary, and which is one of the reasons you'll notice I've got all these containers turned so you can't see the brand names on them. Actually, I should turn that one a little more. There we go. Because I don't want you thinking that's what you should be giving your horse, because your horse might not need that stuff. So again, blood test, number one. Back that up with, well, okay, we know they're low or high in this. Are they getting enough of this or that? There really aren't a lot of good sources of information. One of the most credible ones would probably be the National Research Council, which is all over North America. They have branches, and their recommendations, they actually have a nutritional recommendation for what equines should have in their diet, the nutritional needs, and they will, well, the interesting thing about it, even though they are probably the leading expert, a lot of people don't agree with everything that they say, myself included. There's a few things in there that I'm not sure that that's quite right, but that's as good as it gets. And I've actually seen a number of veterinary medicine people that actually would disagree with some of the recommendations that they have in there. So, you can take it all with a grain of salt. And like I say, it's only been in recent years that there's been any, amount of research done in equine nutritional needs. Very hard information to get. Sometimes it's very hard to understand unless you're very accomplished in chemistry, because many of the ingredients will be listed by their chemical abbreviations. So unless you know most of the stuff on the periodic table of elements, you're going to have a hard time reading it. Unfortunate. But I do want to talk about a couple of things. A lot of well-meaning people, they'll go out and buy all kinds of supplements and feeds and stuff for their horse because they want to make sure that they're getting everything they need. And that's not a bad thing entirely, except that in their intent of doing good, they may actually be doing the harm, because they might actually be giving them things that they don't need in quantities much higher than is safe for them. And I want to talk about one of those, because there's a number of trace elements, very, very small quantities, that they need to function properly in their bodies. And one of them is selenium. And I mention this one because I think it's pretty important, because it's one that it's critical. The horse must have it, but too much can be toxic. And it's one of those things that's very, very small window of what's good and what's not good. You can have too little or too much very easily. And what I find really scary is most feeds and supplements have selenium in them. And the blood tests for all four of my horses say their selenium levels are adequate. They don't need additional selenium. So immediately when I walk into the store to buy any of these products, regardless of what it is, I have to make sure there's no extra selenium added into the supplement or feed, which that immediately eliminates probably 75% of the stuff on the shelves, which is very unfortunate, because there's a couple of them. There's actually still one more ingredient I haven't got here that I haven't been able to source yet that doesn't have something else in it that shouldn't have, that being vitamin E, which is another interesting one to talk about, because they think, okay, now, if the horse has adequate forage in the pasture, you don't even have to worry about that stuff. But if the horse is getting hay most of the year, you might want to supplement your vitamin E. But here's the tricky part is organic vitamin E is actually quite expensive and hard to get. And most manufacturers in most countries, the labeling they don't have to tell you whether it's organic or synthetic. Now, the synthetic stuff is significantly less money, but it's not as easily absorbed by the body, so you actually have to give them probably twice as much. I'm not saying don't go by my recommendation to automatically start feeding your horse twice as much vitamin E, because you don't even know how much it needs in the first place, and you don't know whether it's synthetic or organic. And, well, that goes into my next one, goes right back to the selenium thing. Locally here, the only source of large quantities of vitamin E I've been able to find have additional selenium in them. It also doesn't tell you whether it's organic or artificial, synthetic. So if it was, in fact, synthetic, or if I was to make that assumption and start feeding them twice of what it says, what I normally would for organic vitamin E, I would be giving them way too much selenium. And that would be toxic, possibly even fatal. Don't want to do that. We like our horses. We don't want to hurt them. We want to look after them, which is why we're messing around with all this stuff and trying to, make sure they got a balanced diet with all the extra, micronutrients and everything that they need. Like I say, a lot of people will immediately run out and buy all kinds of feeds and stuff. And, you can spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on, additional feeds and supplements unnecessarily, because you don't actually know what your horse needs. The whole selenium thing, that one just drives me nuts, because it's very hard to find any kind of supplements or feeds that don't have additional selenium in them. And in most cases, your horse doesn't actually need any, depending on where you live, because the nutritional quality of your hay is going to vary a lot. Darn, can't see out this window worth of crap. Now, can't really see much. Window's not very clear. It's just nature of the window. But, even from one end of this field to the other, the elements can change in the soil, and what's in the hay that was growing on the land may change. So these are things you got to be concerned with. But in most cases, like I said, the horse doesn't need additional selenium, so be very, very wary of foods that have added selenium. And I don't know about where you live. It could be different, but all the feed manufacturers around here, most of them are putting additional selenium in, and I have no idea why, because in most cases you don't need it. And too much, bad thing. Okay. Another mistake, there's a lot of myths when it comes to feeding too. A lot of people, you will see, as I mentioned, the salt I got here. Now, in a lot of places you will see people put out salt blocks, meaning well, because salt's important stuff. Having enough sodium in their diet makes sure that they can actually absorb a lot of other minerals as well. It's good for a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons for having salt in your diet. It's important that they get enough salt. But a lot of people think that just throwing a salt block out, that'll do the job. Well, unfortunately, no, it doesn't. Especially when you have quite a few horses. It depends on the size of salt block you use and that sort of thing. But the average horse, one horse, would have to devour an entire salt block in a month in order to get enough salt. So it's actually recommended that you give them some loose salt. So I put a little bit of that in along with the rest of their supplements, help them out a bit. So loose salt, important, very important stuff. And if you only have one or two horses, they're your own, that's fine. Out here, I have to give this to my own horses because, well, there's just about 50 horses out here now, and it wouldn't be possible to put loose salt out for the horses and ensure that mine are actually getting enough, because a bunch of others might be getting it. And honestly, even though salt is relatively cheap, it only cost me about $10 for a 50-pound bag of this stuff. It's still, I can't afford to feed the whole herd. Okay, but loose salt, very important in a horse's diet. There is one supplement, like I said, if you have your own property and you only have a couple of horses, one or two, three, maybe, whatever, put some loose salt out for them, and you can actually put some other stuff in with it, whatever they need. But make sure they have, they'll eat it if they need it. If they don't need it, they won't touch it. It's that simple. It's the kind of thing, and it's not going to hurt them. They'd have to eat an awful lot of salt before they would actually be getting too much that would be harmful for them. It is possible, but it's very unlikely that the horse is going to go ahead and do that on its own. So salt, very important. Little salt blocks, not adequate. You got to give them loose salt, okay? That's one of the things I want to talk about that's a bit of a myth, an old wives' tale. The salt block's good enough. No, it's not. I'm sorry. Other elements that they need, well, like I said, I can't tell you what your horse needs. You're going to have to do some blood tests, some hay analysis, and figure it all out from there. Look on the internet. Like I said, probably one of the few sources you're going to find for a complete breakdown as to what your horse needs is the National Research Council, their nutritional guidelines for equines, and even that some people don't agree with. But before you go out and start buying all this stuff and spending a whole lot of money, because, for example, that stuff right there, that's just about $100 for that little pail right there. So don't think you're going to get off cheap if your horse has certain needs. It could get kind of costly, but in the long run, it's worth it. If the alternate is the horse ends up sick, unrideable, and eventually I have to put it down, I have all those expenses and inconveniences. That's not a big expense, really. You got to think of it this way. If the horse gets what it needs, then whatever it costs for that really isn't that bad. And if it's nutrition necessary for things like hoof care, the hoof health, that could save you a lot of money in vet bills, and having your trimmer come out on a more frequent basis to do corrective trimming or maybe even shoeing if you're into that sort of stuff. So feeding a horse, very important, very difficult task. It's not easy. Don't, just because your friend is giving brand XYZ of feed to their horse doesn't mean that's what you should be giving your horse. They might not even be giving the right stuff to their horse. Get some blood tests done, get a hay analysis done. It might cost you a little bit of money, but it's well worth it in the end if you can make sure that your horse is getting what it needs. And that's really the only way you can make sure. And like I said, I got 4 of them. I opted for the blood tests because of the fact that I got different genders, different breeds, different ages, and their dietary needs are all different. Not by much, actually. I was surprised by the results. They weren't as extremely different as I thought, but there was a little bit of variation in them. And I did see one pattern. It actually had to do with how long I'd had them here. And I think that might have something to do with the pasture, the soil content, and maybe the hay that we're getting here. A lot of things there. But all in all, it didn't turn out to be too bad, but still important in order to keep them healthy and happy. I did have to spend some money on some extra things for them to make sure they're getting those ones up there relatively cheap. Even the only one that was expensive was that one, and I only got one horse that needs that desperately, so that's not real bad. It's still the first pail full I went through. I was actually giving it to all 4 horses till I got the blood test back and discovered that no, the other ones don't really need it all that bad. And for the price of it, I made the decision that I'm only giving it to 1 horse because honestly, that can add up. $100 a pail for that stuff, and if you got 4 horses, a pail that size and the amount that you actually have to give them, that can get pretty expensive. I won't get into that, but anyhow, that's what I want to talk about. Feeding horses. Figure out what they need. Don't just feed your horse according to what your friend or your neighbor or your brother, sister, mother is feeding their horse. Your horse is going to be different than theirs. Its activity level is going to be different. Its metabolism is going to be a little different. Find out what they need, get a blood test done, get a hay analysis done, and make sure that they get what they need, no more, no less. And like I said, there's a couple things like the selenium you got to be real careful with that they don't get too much of. Vitamins A, E, and D, all fat soluble. They can build up in the body. That's both good and bad for the horse. Most of them you don't need to supplement. Depending on the circumstances that the horse is under. So, but like I said, I'm not an expert on nutrition, so I'm not even going to go into that too much. I'm just going to say, before you start buying stuff for your horse, giving it extra feed, special feed, stuff like that, find out what your horse actually needs before you waste a lot of money on stuff you don't need and possibly give the horse too much of something that it doesn't need, and you end up making it sick by trying to be nice to it. Honestly, I've made that mistake. Well, I didn't make the horse sick, but I probably did in the past spend a lot of money before I realized what I was doing. So take some time, put a little effort into finding out what your horse actually needs, spend a little money on some tests, and you'll do okay? Have a good day and feed your horse appropriately. Bye.